Now, it must first be stated that we are entirely to blame, we being hardcores. It is entirely our fault that we want the things we want. It is entirely our problem if we don't get them. Not all of the problems can be treated like it's a real cause at this time. Not everything wrong with it is equivalent to escapism. And in some respects, although the community full of casuals is to blame for the industry not supplying us with higher quality content, the main reason why is actually that it isn't profitable to do so. I cannot stress this enough, and I will do so in every video I can. The illiteracy of gamers is genuinely surprising to me. I am often completely baffled as how easily they are willing to believe what they are being sold. Sometimes ignorance is to blame for this, sometimes it's a short memory. I'm going to talk about both. No Man's Sky seems like, to me, the epitome of gamers having a short memory and being ignorant, so perhaps it's best to start there. I followed this title loosely because I could tell from the first time I saw it that it was going to be an indie game with a small fan base, because I could tell that it was promising too much. But boy, was I wrong. People apparently sharply disagreed with this initial opinion. I saw little to no one with the same skepticism until it was much too late. This is where the first disconnect occurred for me, because I thought it was obvious that using auto-generation as a main source of content is next to impossible to keep interesting without multiplayer, which once again says nothing about the quality of content you are playing, because doing anything with another person is always exciting. A game's quality can only really be measured by your willingness to play it by yourself, and from what I saw, it wasn't going to be cooperative, and that's when I made my conclusion immediately and categorized it as too ambitious for its time and the budget limitations that it probably had. Because the first thing I thought when the idea of auto-generation game came into mind is that I immediately thought of the first example when I encountered this precedent in Elder Scrolls and how boring they got after a while. I immediately thought of how unsustainable it is to have compelling conflict with no structure, much like an MMORPG in fact, which is what the game ultimately suffers from. There's nothing to do, which isn't necessarily bad for reasons I'll mention in just a moment, but what comes first is the fact that not everyone has had this initial opinion. Not everybody thought it was obvious. It really seemed like people believed that it was somehow going to be more than that, which brings me to my main point again. The need to make a better audience. Listen, whenever you hear the idea or a new phrase being revolutionary, original, or whatever, you immediately need to ask yourself this question. For what reason has there never been anyone to do it beforehand? Or why hasn't someone done it already? If the reason isn't technological limitations or copyright infringement, then you need to be highly skeptical. It's like people have this idea about game development that it is completely nebulous and that you can do anything with it, that you get just as much out of it as you put in. This is completely false. You are always fighting upon a knife's edge as to what the platform you're using will allow. As I've stated before, a bigger platform means bigger success, but also bigger competition, and therefore much bigger incentive to push technology to its limits to be able to say you have a unique product. So when I hear about people being disappointed by No Man's Sky, I literally say out loud, well, what the fuck did you expect? Did you really think it would be like Skyrim with spaceships over a planet-sized scale or something? This is why I'm so baffled. I don't get how people can still be surprised by these things. The idea is foreign to me as a hardcore. That people actually believe that a team that small will be able to contend with other big titles by the sheer size of the game. Always remember, repetitive content is not equivalent to more content. Content A is still content A. Being able to recognize what is viable for a given platform is paramount for gauging what a game advertises. I think this is the main reason between casuals and hardcores, which I still maintain is really only defined by a matter of knowing what you want. If you know what it is about a game you're looking for, you're a hardcore in my book. I just think that hardcores, because of this tendency, also tend to be more skeptical about what is advertised because they want to make sure it's exactly what it says it is. That said, it also helps just to be informed in general with the genre, and of course, if they promised big things and didn't deliver, you also need to say it's a bad game. Now, to turn the subject to the opposite spectrum, a well-funded game by a well-known company about a well-known franchise, and the single greatest reason why this video is so much later than the last, FF15, a seemingly desperate attempt by Square Enix to save the Japanese console market, as it were. The extended production time and world building seems to be also exactly what I would want, but of course there's no way to prove how much pre-production was attempted, let alone followed through, and when considering the change of direction of lead designers midway through what some might unthinkingly call, really, completion. And of course it also shares the familiar problem of promising lots of stuff, but not delivering everything, at least not all at once. And this is how I perceive FF15 evolving in the future, much like No Man's Sky. If they know what they're doing, what they're going to attempt is to just upgrade it continuously and add more content permeated throughout. Kind of like Destiny, which is to say piecemeal, with the difference being that FF15 has actually emphasized world building and has had twice the development time to do it, and probably an even bigger budget. But what is most appealing is what I mentioned earlier, that the main motive behind this project is to preserve the console market, which is being encroached upon by mobile apps. Naturally, I find this very attractive. I think in the future console games development will be solely the job of those who intend to push the medium to the limits, complex games in other words. The obvious reason being that simple games can be emulated much more by mobile devices which don't utilize all the resources of a modern console anyways. A relevant parallel might be found in the difference between a motion picture in the theaters and one that airs weekly on TV. There would simply be no reason to play simple games on a console or a PC when the graphics and cinematics aren't the key features and the main content is digested regardless of the medium's capabilities and presentation. The strongest evidence that FF15 was likely intended for this purpose is not only that it represents everything I said earlier about being available to a bigger audience and having a bigger standards that make it stand out as the most attracting looking game ever made, but rather simply that it is really not possible that it was intended for anything less. Nothing else about it implies that it was made with some other purpose but to show off graphics and push to their limits. The story is somewhat incongruent, and the gameplay, while perhaps enjoyable, is very casual and brainless to use. Also, as a very important side note, observe how they are able to square the limited use of summons and magic with its lore. This is something I hardly ever see mentioned, but it's something I've been talking about stories needing for years. It is clear that they prohibited open use of magic as a balancing issue, but also note that how it actually pays off by upholding consistency of how difficult it's supposed to be to use in the first place, and how it complements the power of them, which, by the way, is much more becoming of sorcery. If it's not obvious, this is precedent of sacrificing simplicity for complexity. They are deliberately choosing lore, writing in other words, over melodramatic expediency by way of hopelessly weak magic that becomes useless once you progress through the game. But I'm not here to do a game review, so I'll move on. If what Hajime Tabata said about wanting to sell at least 10 million copies as a goal to help stimulate the console market is true, then it would be inconceivable that it was ever meant to be sold as a regular installment of the FF franchise. The FF13 trilogy, even when you combine all of them, sold only about 11 million copies as of 2014 when they were initially released in 2009, 11 and 13 respectively. To quickly compare, FF15 would have to sell close to this amount with just one game within a much shorter time span if they intend to update it regularly. There is already some evidence to support this, like endings that will change with DLC or be postponed by filling the game with middle content already in the works. And although, while I'm confident about my own speculation here, I still haven't stopped considering other possibilities. It's actually irrelevant, though, because what the salient detail that needs to be observed here is that it really isn't possible not to try something like this. The encroaching mobile games industry will inevitably run consoles into a smaller market space, and it's only natural that this should happen. The service that takes most advantage of the technological and social trends and breakthroughs will always come out on top. And so as portable consoles become integrated with conventional smartphone technology, the need to really own a console will deteriorate exponentially, I would imagine. And it only makes sense that the FF franchise needs to change its format to where the money is currently at, which is games that are constantly being updated and therefore refresh users. League serving as the prime example, I would think. The weakness being exploited here is that visuals, which is essentially what consoles excel at, don't compel hardcores and casuals to revisit content when compared to accessibility and simplicity. Constantly updating story to make this multimedia colossus a monthly consumable by way of DLCs, as it's already doing, is the first step to make its 10 years of world building pay off. Now, believe it or not, even I see both the pros and cons in this endgame. While I wouldn't like to see console markets disappear, I do like the prospect of casual games being restricted to mobile. Either way, though, If anyone listening finds themselves concerned about the eventual division of content on platforms, with the most glaring issue regarding the production as far as its commercial viability is actually not pre-production, as you would all have surely guessed, being avid listeners you are. It's quite often that games spend as much as twice the development costs entirely on post-production. If I had to be objective about the success of console gaming, I would be forced to put aside my demands for quality and push for some kind of reform as to where people get their gaming release information. Post-production is clearly the worst thing to ever happen to games in this way. It is simply too damned expensive to get proper advertisement, and there is only so much to go around, creating an inevitable imbalance. Even if you don't buy anything, as I've said about pre-production, please understand that the absolute best way for gamers to become better consumer-based and in turn a better audience is to make advertising games inexpensive. There needs to be a way, an honest way, to just be informed of what comes available and is inexpensive as possible. I believe I've mentioned this before, but an honest third-party game reviewer is, again, the best option for completely different reasons this time, though. This, coincidentally, is also why I'm not really against Let's Players that are popular, because it is quite literally free advertisement sometimes. It only really becomes a problem when those Let's Players are terrible at what they do and only play popular games, usually because they've been bribed to, I would imagine. So streamers go at it. Just don't think you're not hurting anyone by only playing games that are popular. And now I feel that I've defined how to become a better audience enough for now, and how to do your part to improve the industry, as well as how to define a bad game. I'll go back to how, even if you do all this, it's still not good enough. To concentrate once more on simple and complex content, I actually find it is very difficult to understand how people don't see these things immediately as well. But then I realize that most people are casuals and don't have a grasp on the bigger picture and let promises dictate their favoritism. But seriously, what I mean here is that there is often more to content that people give credit to. But this time I'm not talking about people or the techniques behind it. This time it's about reasoning around ideas commonly perceived as cliches that you really shouldn't find offensive, even if you're as picky as I am. Remember that the setting always plays a big role in this. That is what I like to call, only because I've never heard a name for it, is the tacit approval of events in the setting. It is not exactly Deus Ex Machina for various reasons that I'll discuss now. An example of this is like finding a treasure chest with an item that is useful inside. Firstly, this would never happen in real life, so at first glance you would think this violates immersion and consistency. But the logic behind this is actually a little more complex. Both the idea of finding something in a random spot and a random item being useful is actually sometimes a little easier to grasp by the subtleties of the setting. For instance, if you're in a location rich with junk, trash, and remains everywhere, then you have a basis for the likeliness of finding something that your character's perspectives would see as useful. The presentation of content is actually, in a way, a characteristic of the player character. It is actually implied that your character sees these things in the location you're in because of their own intuition as a property unrelated to the player. Similar properties would be implied expertise, some of which are stated and some of which are not. In Elder Scrolls, the player characters are traditionally always supplied by some form of healing spell and the ability to improve other skills necessary to the game. However, the skills themselves are not exhaustive to all skills shown at work in that universe or anything. It is therefore implied that the player character values these particular sets of skills independently and unrelated to the player. By this logic, it is not difficult to expect that some other form of implicit details to simultaneously affect and explain themselves. As previously mentioned, if you suddenly find yourself in a room with a bookcase and manage to see one of these random books as relevant and therefore given access to, it is implied that the player character doesn't see the rest of these books as relevant to them, and so they ignore them, and rightly so. And the same logic applies to a treasure chest scenario that I mentioned before. It can, although certainly not always, but it can be assumed that the treasure chest, which is originally just a way to present treasure while conserving memory as opposed to drawing individual sprites for every attainable item, serves to imply what your character sees before them as valuable. But this, of course, only solves half the problem, which is why you have access to them. The other half is why the item is there in the first place. This is where a complex lore or plot can come help. Whether you're in a graveyard looting corpses, a shipyard harvesting rare parts, or in a hidden vault underground, the lore is often the only thing that can serve to explain why you suddenly come across these things as commonplace. This would traditionally be how you would employ complex lore and plot, because writing that setting or scenario without them would unavoidably jeopardize suspension of disbelief. Unfortunately, there is also hidden third halves to most of these events despite a good lore. Details that constrict consistency, like the natural progression of difficulty and better items that accompany it later on in the setting, though not entirely unexplained due to the same implications. For instance, perhaps the character finds many items randomly but begins to ignore those that are seen as less value to him or her after already acquiring something of higher quality beforehand. Or another example, drops from certain enemies from whatever game you can think of, armor for instance. It's logical to assume that actually the character, although they can obviously see the armor they've just either killed or damaged or whatever, and find a piece that's preserved because they didn't hit it or whatever, you can still say that, well, they didn't pick it up because it doesn't fit them, as armor does have to be tailored to your individual size, and the likeliness of finding armor specifically tailored to your own individual character is very unlikely. But this is beginning to stretch it, even for someone as logically scrupulous as me. And do keep in mind that this is only true of attainable things that are not deeply impactful to the climax. It is strictly only true when addressing inconsequential details, and only if properly founded on complex lore or plot. It is still not acceptable for you to find the solution to a major problem by simply looking around on the floor until you find something or after killing enough minions, etc. This is necessarily true for the simple reason that if a serious problem can be solved by random people doing random things randomly, then it isn't a serious problem. In case it's not obvious to some, this means that if your plot revolves around the central character that isn't exceptional in any way and doesn't solve the problem by becoming exceptional or by doing something exceptional, then you are guilty of either straight-up Deus Ex Machina or employing the Zelda effect. In short, you also have to have a responsibility to recognize that when you play a game through the lens of a character, an RPG, you need to understand that the character isn't all-seeing or all-knowing and is supposed to make mistakes. You are playing the role of a character. You are not the characters. Such characters are not capable of being assigned meaning of conflict anyways. This means once again it is up to the audience to be honest about how they digest content just as well as it is on developers to make it palatable. And now that I've transitioned the subject back to devs, let me do some more complaining. This has more to do with how simplicity is harmful and why realism is invaluable. The show Attack on Titan, which I gather is popular, has decidedly a simple design despite its clear setting-based plot. The devs of which seem to have no problem showing people, children included, literally being eaten alive for seemingly no reason at first. And take it from me, I have been developing a very original setting-based conflict for a long time. And there is no excuse for not giving a clear reason behind this plot that commands such a serious tone. Usually, the only reason they elect not to explain why or how is because they don't have a good reason. A super philosophy, in other words. They feel like they don't have to say why. But really, they don't have a reason that can possibly justify what you're watching and be equal to it. That's the problem. And in the case of the show, they will not have a reason that can be pseudo-realistic and strictly not supernatural in a setting that isn't explicitly supernatural. It's simply not possible. Having not watched more than the first few episodes, it is easy to foresee that it would intend to drag the secret plot along as long as they can, because they know when they finally say what it is, they know it will be far inferior to what is expected to justify the insanity of what is depicted and sensationalized. They know they don't have a reason that won't be underwhelming in the face of such a harsh reality. The easiest way to tell that it is the case, that if they really did have something profound to say, they would not hesitate to say it. Ask yourself, how quickly did you find out you're the Dragonborn? How quickly did you find out the monsters behave the way they do and why witchers are necessary? There is nothing that could ever justify what the trio of human titan humans are doing to the rest of the people without employing the Zelda effect, in which the backstory or the events that take place before what the audience is shown is used to justify with presuppositions what is happening in the setting. That's how you know when the setting-based conflict is contrived. Just like modern games, it promises a lot and delivers very little. But the beauty of it, from the marketing standpoint, is that as long as people are in suspense, the writers don't have to say why. There is no financial incentive to give closure to anything in anime, especially when you've got nothing to give. If they're smart, they are trying to salvage the plot in their hiatus while dragging the series on as long as possible, so when the raters are finally down, People get tired of waiting, yada yada, so that they can reveal it. And then when people rave and ridicule how they could have possibly taken something so silly so seriously in the first place, once they know why it all happened, they'll laugh. Rinse and repeat for every modern anime. Now, despite what the show actually lists as its explanation at the time of this video, the fact of the matter is that it did exist this way for a good amount of time, and you see my point that it could very well have been engineered this way from the beginning to end, and I assure you that it is exactly how a lot of content is being managed up until the very end. But to take a less strident position, the show Naruto, perhaps guilty of a much lesser crime, being obviously full of supernatural entities, makes a kind of glaring mistake that is obvious to anyone who may have watched the show I just finished talking about. Really, this pertains to any show or media that tries to equate children with adults, though. Now, I'm not going to bother pointing out plot holes or whatever, but rather why a show like this must forever remain a kid's show, and why Attack on Titan can only be considered for adults. Although the gore would usually render this difference as obvious rather quickly, and Naruto clearly being more complex, what is actually not obvious is that it, and content like it, is not as consistent with reality. And yes, there are ways to measure this in fiction. What I'm referring to is basically how none of its characters ever seem to show reflection about their actions or react in a human way in the face of godlike enemies in the way that many kid shows or American action movies arrogantly do not. In Naruto, every character is a trained killer, and many of them have grossly powerful techniques at their disposal. Of these people, many more of them have presumably taken lives of many people, and yet the show is somehow centralized around friendship. They are literally a group of child murderers that the audience has been blissfully convinced are people just fighting for what they believe in and protect who they love. It is the same kind of callousness that is so common in RPGs when you routinely raid and pillage and murder dozens of people in the process, and practically with no traceable consequences or benefits, really, to the setting or the characters. If the distinction between playing a character and playing the role of a character through the perspective were ever absolutely clear, it would surely be here. Content that takes itself seriously deserves to be taken as such. Content that does not, likewise does not deserve to have the same treatment. The lack of authenticity is attributable to both complex and simplistic, but for obvious reason occurs much more in simple concepts. And when this happens, the ideas become stale, as I've described in previous videos. Originality only works once, and shock value only works when applied sparingly, otherwise it is numbed and tasteless. Just imagine for a minute if Kishimoto or anyone who likes the idea of children being tasked with the occupation suited for hardened veterans were to suddenly start treating his or her characters with the same realism as those you see in Attack on Titan. How quickly would it become irreversibly unrecognizable? People suddenly having breakdowns about how they burnt people alive and killed children their own age. You couldn't even look at the characters the same way, I would wager. You would immediately notice that the main character hasn't killed anybody over the course of the entire show or manga. You would immediately notice how much of the violence happens conveniently off-screen. This is especially disturbing when you already have so much violence on-screen as well. The reason I bring this up is because this is how it looks to a random onlooker who isn't watching to see boobs jiggling or in hope of some 14-year-old who looks 24 suck some anime dick. The disconnect here couldn't be more emphasized, and they are not wrong to feel this way. The random onlooker is by default in the right on this occasion because they are affirming their position from the viewpoint of reality. Can you imagine a teenager being in charge of a battalion of modern soldiers? Does anyone really find the idea of people who aren't qualified to take and assume roles in a scenario where you'd expect some form of credential to be available and believable? You really have to realize that this matters to people, and it is unfortunately just another reason why the medium is not taken seriously and it is not commendable. It's also the primary reason why entry-level games and shows are necessary. They don't completely solve the problem, but if they didn't exist, some content simply wouldn't even have a chance to exist either. It is self-evidently clear that for some reason content creators feel like they can just get away with trivializing trauma and other human reactions this way, and then feel justified when they reply to those who object that they simply don't need to watch. Firstly, anyone who treats criticism with phrases like, if you don't like it, mind your own business, must be in the wrong by default. Criticism is the only saving grace of complete freedom. If people are allowed complete freedom without criticism or consequence, then society has invited tragedy. If people are allowed to practice Nazism without criticism, it is obviously bad. If you saw a child being raped and you exclaimed your disapproval, You would not find the response from the rapist, "mind your own business," or "if you don't like it, don't watch," acceptable. Now, once again, it's fine for a kid's show, but recognize that the medium suffers in the form of the status and stigma when you have important human characteristics trivialized, or have openly pedophilic undertones, or show people getting disemboweled like they're stuffed animals, just to make teenage girls seem edgy and serious, etc. My point is, reality should not be treated like an obstacle. If you need to pretend people don't have certain characteristics, or that the laws of physics don't matter, and so forth, then perhaps your story should be revised. You do not get credit for just ignoring realism. You really don't. Simplicity, because of this tendency for the most part, is just lazy. A detail that all of you character enthusiasts will relate to that I didn't get to go over before, but basically falls under the third principle of design, which is that characters' archetypes are not all equal. That is to say that while it's not impossible to write in character traits that are seemingly contradictory, it takes a lot more heavy lifting to give a given pairing authenticity than another pairing. Although, also, as a side note, it usually pays off more when you do the more heavy lifting. It stands out much more. For instance, a character archetype like being a neat freak does not work well with being lazy. It would take a thorough explanation as to how someone can be both of these at the same time. To scale up the severity, an extremely diligent person that is also superficial and petty. These things are typically at great odds with each other and would require a great deal of investment to write a character like this that isn't intuitive at all. Additionally, archetypes also take precedence over each other. This is more of a societal factor really, but for the most part it's pretty universal. For instance, a character that is rowdy and flirtatious, but is charged with taking care of their family in place of his or own parents, will not and should not exhibit qualities of the former except under very specific conditions. The burden of the second trait takes precedence over the first. Finally, at the highest extreme, an extraordinary genius, an archetype that is usually at the top of the hierarchy of traits, who is also 16-year-olds and can barely drive and therefore can't be relied upon when the plot demands it. Is the picture coming across yet that these things are only getting further and further away from each other? Can anyone authentically see themselves taking this mixed-match character identity seriously? And yet, these sorts of pairings seem to happen all the time within the genre with no explanation that I'm aware of. The problem with simplicity is that in efforts to simply cut to the chase, they glue together whatever popular character tropes are available. Ask yourself, why does the main character of all of these animes and content need to be hopelessly young but be depicted as twice that age? This has never really been explained to me beyond the excuse that kids find it relatable somehow. I personally don't buy it. I've never met a kid who indulged the fantasy that they could really be the ninja kid who spits fire and lightning. And furthermore, I've never met the child who was stopped from indulging a fantasy about being a given superhero because of age differences. Now again, ask yourself, why does there have to be a love interest that never goes anywhere till the end of it all, when the main character is clearly more than capable of having a relationship by sheer proxy of the fact that he or she is accomplishing much more rigorous things in the plot itself, only to be tongue-tied in the presence of the opposite sex? Or the same sex, truthfully. I'm sure that half of people are sick of being represented as a taboo in conventional plot. But regardless, if people are vicariously indulging the idea of being younger and the center of the world and being in love, yada yada, when they watch shows or content like this, I think it says a great deal about the kind of person it tends to attract, which of course is yet another reason why it isn't commendable. So it should come as no surprise that simplicity has no real benefits in setting-based or character-based plots and doesn't really belong in a trade that demands millions of dollars in technology and education and effort to create. And with that, I feel like now I've said my piece on everything that needs to be mentioned before the full disclosure of generation. In all of my videos thus far, I'm hoping to anyone watching will notice that I am not appealing to developers or producers at all. I'm appealing to you, the consumer, to you here and now, that I know what I'm doing. It's been far too long since the medium was revolutionized in a serious way. Hopefully FF15 will have made the first of many steps there. But before I go for another long period, it pleases me to say that I did find at least one, I hope to say, like-minded individual on YouTube here. He goes by Mr. B Tongue and seems to share many of the same opinions to my pleasure. But we also disagree on several other things to my even greater pleasure, since I get to say at least some of what I've said here is original in some way. I'm not sure if he would like it that I'm talking about him, but I cannot refrain from citing his channel to anyone remotely similar to myself. In the somewhat distant future, hopefully by the time I'm published, I will be able to revamp these videos for general consumption. And at that point, the race will be on. I had still planned to make one more video about copyright laws affecting developers, but that will have to wait for now. It will need to be discussed, though, thoroughly. Until then, hang in there.